Most gardeners do not lose their harvest in August. They lose it in April, in May, in the decisions that felt completely reasonable at the time, the transplant spacing that seemed fine, the watering schedule that looked adequate on paper, the support they planned to install next weekend, when the plants got a little bigger. By the time August arrives and the evidence is visible, the damage was done months earlier by someone who was trying their hardest with an incomplete map. That is the part nobody talks about. The gap between effort and outcome in a summer garden is not usually about laziness or bad luck or wrong climate. It is almost always about 7 specific mistakes, each one invisible in the moment it is made, each one compounding quietly through spring and early summer, until the whole season unravels at once, in late July when you can no longer pretend the garden is going to turn around. I want to close that gap today, not with a checklist of vague reminders you have already read a dozen times, with the actual mechanism behind each mistake, the biology, the chemistry, the physics of why these specific errors produce these specific failures. Because once you understand what is actually happening inside the plant and inside the soil, these mistakes become nearly impossible to make again. 7 mistakes, each one preventable, each one carrying a precise correction that costs almost nothing once you know what you are actually fixing. Drop your state or your USDA hardiness zone in the comments right now. Just type it zone, 6 bytes. Texas, Ohio, wherever you are growing. That information shapes every piece of content on this channel, and I read every single one. Mistake 1. You are watering on a schedule instead of responding to your soil. There is a number that circulates through every gardening article, every seed packet, every garden club conversation in America. 1 inch of water per week. Water your garden once a week. Set a day, stick to it. Done. That number is not wrong. Exactly. It is just dangerously incomplete. And the gap between what it says and what it actually means is responsible for more wilted plants, more abandoned harvests, and more end-of-season disappointment than almost any other single piece of advice in home gardening. Here is what 1 inch per week actually requires you to understand. Soil is not uniform. Sandy soil drains so fast that 1 deep watering on Monday is largely gone by Wednesday. Dense clay soil holds water so long that watering on Monday and again on Friday leaves the root zone waterlogged, oxygen-starved, and rotting quietly underground, while the leaves above ground still look fine. Raised beds with quality growing mix dry out faster than in-ground beds in the same heat. A garden in full afternoon sun needs meaningfully more water than the same garden in partial shade. A container needs daily attention in summer heat when a ground bed can go 3 days. A fixed schedule ignores all of that, and the plants pay for the ignorance. What you need instead is a single habit that takes 10 seconds and costs nothing. Before you water, push your finger 2 inches into the soil near the base of the plant. If it is dry at 2 inches, water. If it is still moist, do not come back tomorrow and check again. That is the entire system. It accounts for rain, heat, soil type, and microclimate automatically because you are reading the actual conditions instead of following a calendar. When you do water, water deeply. You want moisture penetrating 8 to 12 inches into the root zone, so roots grow downward towards stable moisture reserves, rather than staying near the surface where they are fully exposed to heat and the drying. A slow, deep watering once or twice a week in most conditions is dramatically better than a shallow, daily sprinkle that never reaches where the roots actually live. And the direction matters as much as the depth. Water at the base of the plant, at soil level, not from overhead. Wet foliage sitting through warm afternoons and evenings is the primary environment where fungal diseases, the ones that show up as spots, lesions, gray powder, and collapsing stems, find their ideal conditions to take hold. Keep the leaves dry. Water the roots. Mistake 2. You planted before the soil was actually ready. The date on the seed packet says last frost plus 2 weeks. The calendar says that date has passed. The sun is out and the air feels warm, and every instinct you have says it is time to get things in the ground. But your soil temperature is still 48 degrees Fahrenheit. And at 48 degrees, most summer vegetable seeds will not germinate at all. The ones that do will sit there, cold and stressed, for 3 weeks before producing a seedling half the size and half the vigor of a seedling started in properly warmed soil. That transplant, you set out early because the air felt right, will sit in cold ground for 2 weeks, doing essentially nothing, while the plant you set out 3 weeks later into warmer soil catches up and passes it within a month. Soil temperature is the variable that controls germination, root development, nutrient uptake, and microbial activity in your growing medium. And most gardeners never measure it once. A basic soil thermometer costs under $15 and is reusable indefinitely. Know the minimum soil temperatures for what you are growing. Warm season crops: squash, cucumbers, peppers, melons. The beans need soil at 60 degrees minimum to germinate reliably, with 65 to 70 degrees being genuinely optimal. Corn needs 50 degrees minimum, but performs far better above 60. Cool season crops: lettuce, spinach, peas. Brassicas prefer soil in the 45 to 65 degree range and will actually stall or bolt in soil that is too warm. There is a second dimension to soil readiness that goes beyond temperature. Soil that is too wet to work. Soil that compacts into a ball and holds its shape when you squeeze a handful should not be tilled, dug, or walked on. Working wet soil destroys the pore structure that allows roots to penetrate, water to drain, and air to reach the root zone. You can take a soil that took years to build into something excellent and compact it into a dense, drainage-impaired layer in a single morning of premature planting. Wait, measure. Let the soil tell you it is ready, instead of assuming the calendar means it is. Mistake 3. You are fertilizing without knowing what you are actually fixing. There is a product in most garden sheds in this country that causes more crop failure than it prevents. It is the all-purpose balanced fertilizer that gets applied to every bed, every season, regardless of what the soil already contains and regardless of what the plants growing in it actually need right now. Fertilizer is not plant food in the way the marketing implies. It is targeted chemistry that addresses specific deficiencies at specific moments in a plant's development cycle. Applying the wrong formula at the wrong time does not just fail to help, it can actively interfere with the plant's ability to use what it already has. Here is the specific example that catches the most gardeners off guard. Nitrogen drives vegetative growth, leaves, stems, the green structural mass of the plant. Your garden needs nitrogen, especially early in the season when plants are building the framework that will eventually carry a fruit or seed load. But as plants transition from vegetative growth into flowering and fruiting, excess nitrogen becomes a direct problem. It continues to drive leaf production at the expense of the reproductive process. You get magnificent, lush, vigorous plants that flower reluctantly, set fruit poorly, and deliver far less at harvest than their size suggests they should. Phosphorus is what stimulates root development and flower bud formation. Potassium is what manages fruit development, sugar concentration, and cell wall strength. A fertilizer profile that made complete sense in early May becomes actively counterproductive by mid-June if you have not shifted the formula to reflect where the plants are in their development. The second thing that costs gardeners every season is fertilizing without ever testing the soil. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium can be present in your soil in completely adequate amounts. If your soil pH has drifted too high or too low, those nutrients become chemically unavailable to plant roots, regardless of how much is sitting there. The plant shows deficiency symptoms. You apply more fertilizer, nothing changes. Because the problem is not a shortage, it is a lockout caused by pH. A basic soil test, available from your county extension service for under $20, tells you your pH and your existing nutrient levels before you spend $1 on amendments. It converts fertilizing from guesswork into precision, and a basic pH meter, also under $20 and reusable indefinitely, lets you monitor throughout the season and catch drift before it causes visible damage. Mistake 4. You are letting the wrong things compete with your plants. Weeds are the most visible version of this mistake, and the most straightforward to address. Pull them early, before they establish root systems that rival your crops and before they set seed and multiply the problem tenfold. A weed pulled at 2 inches tall takes 5 seconds. A weed pulled at 12 inches tall after it has rooted deeply may disturb the surrounding soil and nearby crop roots in the process. Early is always faster and always better. But the competition problem that costs gardeners the most is the one that is invisible above ground. When you plant summer crops at the spacing that feels generous, 12 inches between plants when the tag recommends, 18, 2 plants to a pot that should hold 1, you create a root competition situation underground that neither plant wins. 2 plants whose root systems overlap significantly are sharing the same soil volume for water and nutrients. Both produce less than a single well-spaced plant would. The plants above ground may look fine through June. By August, when fruit is sizing up and the demand on the root system is at its peak, the limitation shows up in the harvest. Space is not wasted when plants are given room. It is invested. A well-spaced plant with access to its full root territory consistently outproduces an overcrowded plant at higher density. Give the tag recommendation serious respect. If it says 18 inches, plant at 18 inches. The empty ground between transplants in May will not look empty in July. There is a more dramatic version of this mistake that ends entire beds without the gardener understanding why. If you have a black walnut tree on your property, or near your garden, Juglans nigra, a tree native across much of the eastern United States, be aware that it produces a compound called juglone from its roots, leaves, hulls, and decomposing wood that is acutely toxic to many vegetable crops. Squash, peppers, and several other common vegetables are highly sensitive. The toxic zone extends roughly 1.5 times the tree's height in all directions from the trunk, and juglone can persist in the soil for years after a tree is removed. Plants affected by juglone wilt and collapse without obvious explanation and do not respond to any treatment because the cause is not disease or drought. Know whether this tree exists near your growing area before you invest a season's effort in that ground. Mistake 5. You are not managing what happens above the soil. 2 practices that commercial growers treat as non-negotiable are almost universally skipped in home gardens. Both of them address the same underlying dynamic: the relationship between the foliage structure you maintain and the disease. Pressure your garden operates under all season. The first is lower, foliage removal. As your vegetable plants grow taller and begin to set fruit, the leaves on the lowest third of the plant fall increasingly into the shadow of the canopy above them and stop contributing meaningfully to photosynthesis. But they are not harmless. Low-hanging foliage that touches or nearly touches the soil surface is a direct infection route for soil-borne fungal pathogens. Rain and irrigation water hits the soil, splashes upward, and deposits spores directly onto those leaves. Moist foliage at soil level provides exactly the germination environment those spores need. Infection takes hold and works its way up through the plant over the remaining weeks of the season. Strip the lower third of foliage gradually over the course of the season. Never remove more than 1/3 of total leaf area in a single session on dry days with clean tools. The result is a plant with improved airflow at the base, significantly reduced splash transfer of pathogens, and meaningfully lower disease pressure from the ground up through late summer. The second practice is what experienced growers call topping, and it is the most underused late-season tool in home gardening. By late summer, typically 4 to 6 weeks before your expected first fall frost date, you're indeterminate. Crops are still trying to grow, still pushing out new shoot tips, new flowers, new developing fruit. The problem is calendar math. Most fruiting crops need 50 to 80 days from pollination to full ripeness. Fruit that begins to develop in late August, in a zone where frost arrives in mid-October, may not have enough time to ripen. When you remove the main growing tip of an indeterminate plant, you send a hormonal signal through the plant that stops new vertical growth. The auxin driving that upward extension is gone. The plant redirects its remaining metabolic resources into the fruit already on the vine. What was green and developing begins to swell faster and ripen more completely. You stop the plant from starting projects it cannot finish and redirect everything into the harvest already in progress. Learn your average first frost date. Count back 6 weeks. Mark that date as the day you top every indeterminate plant that has not yet been stopped by another means. In short-season zones, this single habit can convert a garden full of green fruit at frost into a full, complete harvest. Mistake 6. You are fighting pest and disease problems instead of preventing them. There is a reason the most effective commercial growing operations spend almost nothing on emergency interventions and a great deal on environmental management. Because an infection or infestation you are managing reactively has already cost you something: time, yield, plant energy, and the interventions that address it after the fact are expensive, labor-intensive, and only partially effective. The prevention logic is simple and almost entirely structural. Airflow through the plant canopy is one of the primary defenses your garden has against fungal disease. Overcrowded plantings, unpruned dense canopies, and low-hanging foliage create the humid, stagnant air that pathogens need. Open canopies with good spacing, lower foliage removed, and plants trained upright on proper support maintain airflow and dry out faster after rain or irrigation conditions under which fungal spores struggle to establish. Crop rotation is the second structural prevention tool that is simultaneously the most recommended and most ignored practice in home gardening. When you grow the same plant family in the same bed year after year, the pathogens that target that family accumulate in the soil. The fungal spores, the bacterial inoculants, the specific insect pests that overwinter in the vicinity of their preferred food source, all of them build up over successive seasons until the disease pressure in that specific bed becomes almost impossible to manage. Through any spray program, moving plant families to different beds on a 3-year minimum rotation disrupts that accumulation. The pathogens that specialized in attacking what you grew in betta last year find a non-host crop in betta this year, and a non cannot complete their life cycle. Rotate by family, not by individual plant. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, and potatoes are all nightshades and share most of the same pathogens. Moving a tomato out of a bed and putting a pepper in the same bed next year provides no rotational benefit. Know the families. Nightshades, cucurbits, squash, cucumber, melons, brassicas, cabbage, kale, broccoli, alliums, onions, garlic, leeks, legumes, beans, peas, and move the entire family together. Mistake 7. You installed support late or chose the wrong support entirely. This mistake happens through logic that feels completely sound in the moment. The transplant is small. The support structure feels premature and unnecessary. You tell yourself you will set it up next weekend when the plant is bigger and you can see how it is going to develop. And 3 weeks go by. You come back to a plant that is spread outward under its own weight, snapped a stem under a developing fruit cluster, and dropped everything it was carrying toward the ground. And what happens when foliage and fruit make sustained contact? With damp soil is fast and irreversible. Fruit rots quickly. Foliage pressed against soil stays permanently wet and becomes an infection site for every pathogen discussed in this video. Insects find ground-level fruit far more accessible than elevated, supported plants. The damage compounds before you can stop it. The rule is non-negotiable. Install support at the moment of planting, not next week, not when the plant looks like it needs it, the moment the transplant goes into the ground, when the soil is still loose and unoccupied by roots, before the plant has any weight that needs managing. Match support to the variety. A standard wire cage from the garden center, 30 to 36 inches tall, is appropriate for compact bush-type plants. Put that same cage around a large, indeterminate variety that will reach 5 to 7 feet and carry substantial weight by August, and it will tip over. For large vining crops, build support from heavy-gauge galvanized hardware, wire formed into a tall cylinder and staked firmly to the ground. For row plantings, a string trellis stretched between well-driven T-posts Gives you a vertical plane to train plants against as they grow, the same basic system that commercial growers use at scale, because it works at every scale. Whatever system you choose, use soft ties against the stems, cotton twine, soft silicone clips, strips of old fabric. Never wire, never zip ties, never stiff plastic, directly against plant tissue, as a stem grows and thickens. A rigid tie that was loosely installed in May becomes a constriction in July that cuts into the vascular tissue and reduces the quality and size of everything the plant is trying to produce above that point. Check ties weekly. Re-tee when needed. The 10 minutes you invest in this through the season protects everything else. When you look at all 7 of these mistakes together, the pattern that emerges is not complicated. Every one of them is a version of the same gap, the gap between what the plant and soil actually need and what the gardener assumed was sufficient. The calendar-based watering schedule that ignored what the soil was actually holding. The early planting that skipped the soil thermometer. The blanket fertilizer application that bypassed what was already present and what was actually needed. The spacing decision that made sense in May and showed its cost in August. The foliage that stayed low and wet because nobody told you to remove it. The reactive pest response that arrived weeks after prevention could have made it unnecessary. The support cage that was fine for the wrong plant. None of these are failures of commitment. Every one of them is a failure of information. You have the information now. The garden you build this summer is not the same garden as last summer. Not because the soil is different or the climate has changed, but because you are now working with an accurate map, and that changes everything about where you end up.